the night enveloped the city in a blanket of darkness. The cold wind cut through the air as 17-year-old Max moved silently through the deserted streets on the outskirts of town. He was nervous, but his determination overcame his fear. His mother, weak and ill, was at home, needing expensive medication he couldn't afford. Since his father abandoned them years ago, Max had taken on the responsibility of caring for her, and the hardships only grew by the day. With few options and the pressure of putting food on the table, Max had fallen into a life of petty theft. He didn't want to be a thief, but he felt he had no other choice. His older friends had convinced him that stealing was the easiest way. Now, facing a financial crisis at home, Max found himself considering a more daring heist. The abandoned mansion on the hill seemed like the perfect target. Old and isolated, it had once belonged to a wealthy family that mysteriously disappeared, or so the local stories said. Rumor had it that valuable items were still inside, forgotten by time. To Max, this seemed like a golden opportunity. He spent the previous afternoon observing the place. The mansion stood apart from neighboring houses, surrounded by old trees and cloaked in an aura of mystery. The windows were covered in dust, and the facade showed signs of decay. No one seemed to care about the place. There were no cameras, alarms, or security, making the mission even more tempting. Max arrived at the mansion close to midnight, with a flashlight and crowbar in his backpack. The place looked even gloomier at night, but he pushed aside the chill running down his spine. This wasn't the time to feel fear. He was doing this for his mother, he told himself. This was his only chance to make quick money. Moving carefully, he approached the front door, which, surprisingly, was slightly ajar. He gently pushed the door open, and it creaked long and eerily. The air inside the mansion was thick, carrying the scent of mold and decay. Darkness engulfed everything, except for the beam from Max's flashlight, which cut through the gloom, revealing dust-covered furniture, old objects, and a tapestry worn by time. Max's heart pounded. He began to search the rooms on the ground floor, but nothing seemed valuable enough to justify the risk. The sound of his own breathing was the only noise in the mansion, until something unexpected happened. He heard a faint sound, like irregular breathing. Max stopped, his senses on high alert. He gripped the flashlight tighter, listening again. The sound was coming from upstairs. He hesitated. No one was supposed to be in that mansion. It was abandoned. But the breathing was unmistakable, and fear started creeping over him. He thought about leaving, but his curiosity got the better of him. Carefully climbing the stairs, Max approached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open, and when he pushed it with his trembling hand, the flashlight revealed something he never could have imagined. An old man was chained to the bed. His hair was white and disheveled, his skin pale and thin. His clothes were dirty and torn, and although his eyes were tired, they gleamed with a silent plea. "Please," the old man murmured, his voice weak and trembling. "Help me." Max was paralyzed. His racing heart and the cold sweat on his forehead made it clear he wasn't prepared for this. Who was this man? And why was he locked up in that mansion? Max's stomach turned as he looked at the old man chained to the bed. It didn't make sense. Who was this man? And why was he imprisoned in an abandoned mansion? The boy took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't prepared for anything like this. In fact, everything seemed to have spiraled out of control the moment he entered that place. The old man looked directly at Max, his sunken eyes filled with desperation. He reached out a trembling hand toward the boy. "Please, help me," he murmured, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Max took a step back, fear tightening his throat. His plan had been simple: get in, grab a few valuables, and leave unnoticed. Nothing more. He didn't want to get involved in something so dark. But something about the man's face made him hesitate. He looked too weak to be a threat. "Who did this to you?" Max asked, still not approaching, his voice low and full of distrust. The old man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. My son," he replied, the words coming out with great effort. "He locked me here. He's waiting for me to die so he can get all the inheritance." A chill ran down Max's spine. Inheritance? This was getting stranger and stranger. The old man seemed too fragile to be lying, but the idea that his own son had chained him to the bed was too disturbing for Max to process immediately. He visits me sometimes," the old man continued, his voice growing weaker. "Brings food, but just enough so I don't die too quickly." Max stood frozen. His mind raced in every direction. If the old man was telling the truth, he couldn't just turn his back and leave. But helping the man meant getting involved in something much bigger than he had anticipated. And what if the son showed up? Before he could make any decision, a disturbing sound filled the air, footsteps in the hallway. His heart leaped. Someone was coming up the stairs. Panic gripped Max. He couldn't be seen there. There was no way to explain what he was doing in that house. Without thinking twice, he hid behind a large wardrobe, pressing himself against the cold wood, barely breathing. The door to the room opened slowly. Max, trying to stay as quiet as possible, peered through the crack between the wardrobe and the wall. A tall man entered the room. It was the old man's son. The man was well dressed, wearing an immaculate suit, but his expression was cold and cruel. He looked at his chained father with a mixture of contempt and indifference. "Still alive, father," he said with a wicked smile. "Don't worry. This will all be over soon. Just a few more days, and the world will forget about you. And I'll have everything." The old man tried to speak, but his voice failed, and he lowered his head in defeat. Max, hidden, felt his heart racing even faster. He needed to get out of there, but there was no way to escape without being seen. And now, he knew that the old man was truly a victim. He couldn't just leave him behind. The man stayed in the room for a few more minutes, muttering to himself as he fiddled with a golden pocket watch he carried. He seemed to be just making sure his father was still there, trapped, unable to escape. Before leaving, the man leaned down and whispered something cruel into his father's ear, but Max couldn't hear what it was. When the man finally left, closing the door behind him, Max let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped out from behind the wardrobe, his mind spinning. Now he had a choice to make. He looked at the old man, still chained, with silent tears running down his cheeks. The son had said it would all be over soon. If Max did nothing, the old man would likely die there, alone, a victim of his son's greed. Max knew that if he were caught, the consequences would be severe. He was a thief, yes, but he wasn't a killer. He couldn't allow this to happen. But helping the old man meant putting his own life at risk. "You need to free me," the old man begged, his voice faltering. Max took a deep breath and looked at the door the man had left through. There were no more footsteps in the hallway, and the house was silent once again. Perhaps he had a chance to get out without being noticed. "I'll help you," Max said, with more conviction than he felt. "But we have to be quick." Max's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He didn't have much time. The old man was weak, chained up for days, maybe even weeks. Max knew that if he didn't act fast, the opportunity to escape would slip away, and the consequences would be terrible. He began examining the chains. They were secured with a simple but strong padlock. Max looked around, searching for something to break the lock or, hopefully, find a key. His eyes fell on a small table next to the bed. In a slightly open drawer, something shiny caught his eye. He opened it, and to his luck, there was a metal key. With trembling hands, he grabbed the key and tried to unlock the padlock. As he struggled with the lock, the old man murmured, You don't know what you're doing, boy, if he finds out." Max cut him off. "I know. But I can't leave you here. We need to get out now." With a click, the padlock opened. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room, but Max didn't have time to worry. He freed the old man from the chains, and with some effort, helped him to his feet. The man could barely stand, his legs trembling and frail after so much inactivity. "Let's go." "We have to get out before he comes back," Max said, placing the old man's arm over his shoulder. Together, they began to struggle down the hallway of the mansion. Max moved as quietly as possible, but the old man's weakened body made noise with every step. He could barely walk, and Max had to stop several times to adjust his position and help him keep moving. The sound of their footsteps seemed amplified by the silence of the house. Every creak of the wooden floor made Max's heart skip a beat. But he kept guiding the old man down the stairs, slower than he would have liked, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign that the sun might appear. When they finally reached the ground floor, Max thought they might actually make it. He could already see the back door in the distance. The exit was just a few meters away. But as they started to approach, a loud alarm blared, cutting through the silence like a blade. Max froze. The alarm was triggered. He hadn't seen anything that indicated a security system, but clearly, the old man's son had set everything up to prevent an escape. "No," the old man murmured, panic rising in his voice. He's going to catch us." Max looked around frantically, trying to think. They didn't have much time. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the halls. Someone was coming. The old man's son, no doubt, alerted by the alarm. Without thinking, Max pushed the old man aside, hiding him behind a nearby bookshelf. He positioned himself on the other side, trying to calm his breathing and figure out how they could escape. He had freed the old man, but if they were caught now, it would have all been for nothing. The back door slammed open, and the old man's son entered, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and triumph. Behind him, two burly men followed. They looked like hired muscle, men paid to ensure the old man didn't escape and that no one interfered. "Where are you, father?" the son shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "I thought you were smarter than this." Max peeked from behind the bookshelf and saw the son moving closer, his eyes scanning the room. "There's no point in trying to run," he continued, now in a softer, almost mocking tone. "You're not going anywhere. And the boy who tried to help you." He laughed, a cruel and disturbing sound. "He's not leaving here alive." Max felt cold sweat drip down his forehead. He had to think fast. The son was distracted, confident he would catch his father in a matter of minutes. The boy glanced around the room and saw a small window, high but accessible. It was risky, but their only chance. He looked at the old man, who stared back at him with a mix of fear and hope. Max made a silent gesture, indicating that he would help him escape through the window. The old man nodded, trying to move as quietly as possible. But before they could make any moves, the son stopped, as if sensing something. His eyes slowly turned toward where they were hiding. "Ah, there you are." He had found them. Max froze for an instant when he heard the old man's son's cold words, "There you are." The cruel smile on his face made it clear he was satisfied with cornering them. He began walking toward them, accompanied by his two henchmen. The sound of their boots echoed on the wooden floor, and the tension in the air seemed to suffocate Max. He knew he didn't have much time to act. The old man beside him was too weak to run, and Max knew they couldn't flee. They needed another strategy. Out of the corner of his eye, Max saw a small table with a heavy lamp on it. A crazy idea formed in his mind. "Stay down," he whispered to the old man. Max quickly stood up, grabbed the lamp, and threw it hard at the son. The object flew through the air and struck one of the henchmen squarely, causing him to stumble and fall. The impact was strong, and for a few seconds, the henchman remained on the floor, dazed. "Get them," the son shouted, furious. The other henchman charged at Max, but the boy was quicker. He ducked, grabbed the old man by the sleeve, and pushed him toward the small window he had spotted earlier. It was a risk, but their only chance. "We'll get out through here," Max said urgently. The old man, despite his frailty, made a monumental effort to get up and drag himself toward the window. Meanwhile, the henchman closed in on Max, who was still trying to help the old man out the window. Max glanced back, seeing the man getting closer. Desperation fueled his movements, and he managed to push the old man through to the other side. But before he could escape too, the henchman grabbed him by the arm, forcing him to face the crushing strength of the man. "Did you think you could get away that easily, boy?" the henchman growled, yanking Max back hard. Max tried to fight back, but the man was too strong. Then, the old man, now outside, shouted something surprising. "Don't touch him." His voice carried a strength Max hadn't expected. "Let him go, or I swear you'll never see a cent of that inheritance." The henchman hesitated for a moment, his eyes turning toward the old man, and Max took advantage of the distraction. With a quick movement, he freed himself from the henchman's grip and jumped through the window, landing next to the old man in the overgrown garden. The old man's son, furious at his henchman's hesitation, rushed to the window, but it was too late. Max and the old man were outside, stumbling through the garden toward the exit. "This isn't over," the son shouted in rage. "I'll find you, no matter where you hide." Max and the old man kept running, or rather, Max carried the old man, who could barely walk, while the boy did his best to move quickly. They weaved through the dense vegetation surrounding the mansion, with the sound of the furious henchman close behind. As they ran, Max felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Amid the chaos, he had recorded the audio of the conversation between the son and his father. A plan began to form in his mind. They reached a small barn, hidden in the shadows of the vegetation around the mansion. Max helped the old man settle in a corner and took a deep breath, trying to think of a way out. They couldn't just keep running. Sooner or later, they would be caught. "We need a plan," Max said, while the old man tried to catch his breath. "They won't stop until they kill me," the old man murmured, looking at the ground. Max was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the man's words. But then he remembered the recording. "I recorded what he said," Max finally revealed. "Everything. The confession. He said he was going to kill you for the inheritance. We can use that against him." The old man looked at Max, surprised. For the first time, there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "You recorded it?" he asked, his voice still trembling. Max nodded. "Yes. And this could be our salvation. We can take this to the police." But before they could celebrate the idea, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. They were being followed again. Max knew they couldn't keep running forever. He had to take a risk. He grabbed his phone and, with trembling hands, sent the recording to the local police. They needed to buy time until help arrived. "Let's try to sneak out through the back of the barn," Max said. "If we can stay hidden, they might not see us until the police show up." The old man nodded, trusting Max. It was a risky plan, but it was all they had. The sound of footsteps and voices grew closer with every second. Max and the old man were hidden behind the barn, trying to catch their breath while the boy quickly thought of a plan. They were cornered, with little time to move before being found. Max had sent the recording to the police, but now everything depended on how long it would take for them to arrive. And, by the looks of it, it wouldn't be fast enough. "He won't stop until he kills me," the old man said, his voice almost hopeless. "You should have run when you had the chance, boy. This isn't your problem." Max looked at the fragile man beside him. His body was weak, but his eyes carried an old, deep pain. Despite his fear, the boy knew he couldn't abandon the old man. Running was no longer an option. "I'm not leaving you," Max said firmly. "I've come this far, and I'm not giving up now. The police are on their way. We just have to hold on a little longer." The old man nodded slowly, but it was clear he was losing strength. Max knew they couldn't keep running. They needed to hide or somehow mislead the pursuers until the police arrived. The voices grew louder. "Search everywhere," the old man's son shouted, angry. "They can't have gone far." Max looked around desperately, searching for anything that could help them buy time. Then, he noticed an old cart covered in dry leaves and cobwebs, right next to a small storage shed behind the barn. A plan began to form in his mind. "Come on, quickly," Max whispered, helping the old man to his feet again. They moved silently, slipping behind the cart. Max began covering the old man with dry leaves and hid him as best he could among the old objects in the shed. He hid on the other side, watching the barn entrance from a distance. The sound of heavy boots echoed nearby. The henchmen were very close now. Max peeked through a crack, seeing the old man's son enter the barn with his men. The man looked possessed by rage. His eyes scanned every corner, and he kicked objects on the ground while muttering angrily. "Find them," he shouted to his henchmen. "I'm not leaving here without my father." The henchmen spread out, searching the barn and the surrounding area. Max knew they didn't have much time. If they were found, it would be the end. Suddenly, the sound of sirens in the distance made Max's heart race. The police were finally on their way. But the sound also caught the henchmen's attention, and they stopped, looking around in alarm. "What's going on?" one of the men asked. The old man's son turned pale. He knew that if the police arrived and found his father alive, all his plans would collapse. "Come on, quickly," he shouted. "They're here somewhere. We have to find them before the police arrive." Max knew this was his chance. They were distracted, and the sirens were getting closer. Now, he had to act fast. He looked at the old man, still hidden, and with one last determined glance, he stepped out of his hiding spot, grabbed an old wooden stick, and with a swift movement, knocked over one of the crates, making a loud noise. The henchman immediately turned toward the sound, but Max wasn't there anymore. He had moved quickly, running to the other side of the barn. His plan was clear: distract the men, lead them away from the old man until the police arrived. "There he is," one of the henchmen shouted, running toward Max. The boy ran out of the barn, guiding the henchman away. The old man stayed where he was, hidden under the leaves. Max could hear the heavy footsteps of the men behind him, but he kept running as fast as his legs could carry him, zigzagging through the vegetation surrounding the mansion. The sound of the sirens grew louder. They were getting closer. Max knew that if he could keep them distracted for a few more minutes, they would be saved. But the old man's son wasn't willing to give up so easily. He pulled out a gun from inside his coat and began running after Max, his eyes full of hatred. "You won't beat me, boy," he shouted, as the henchman tried to catch up. Max, however, didn't look back. He knew time was on his side now. The lights of the police cars began to appear in the distance, cutting through the darkness of the night. Max kept running until he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. A shot. He fell to the ground from the impact. The old man's son reached him, panting and triumphant. He approached Max, who was on the ground, trying to get up. With the gun pointed at the boy, the man smiled coldly. "It's over for you," he said with disdain. But before he could do anything, the red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the scene. The police arrived quickly and surrounded the man. "Drop the gun," one of the officers shouted. The old man's son hesitated for a second, but soon dropped the gun to the ground. He knew he had lost everything. The police arrested him immediately, while Max, wounded, was taken to an ambulance. The boy looked at the old man, who was found and taken to the hospital safely. Max lay on the ambulance stretcher, his body exhausted and his shoulder throbbing with pain from the gunshot. The sound of police sirens still echoed around, but now, instead of fear, they brought a sense of relief. He had done it. Even injured, the boy knew he had saved the old man from a cruel fate. As the paramedics tended to his wound, Max observed the chaos around him. The old man's son was being handcuffed by two police officers, his expression a mixture of desperation and anger. He looked at Max for a moment, and the boy saw the hatred in his eyes. But now, it didn't matter anymore. He had lost. "You'll never get away with this, boy," the man shouted, trying to struggle against the police officers. "I'll still get you." Max didn't react. He knew those were the desperate words of someone who had been defeated. The truth was on his side now. As the old man's son was taken to the police car, one of the officers approached Max. He was holding the phone the boy had used to record the confession. "You were very brave, kid," the officer said. This recording will ensure he never touches anyone again." Max nodded, feeling the weight of everything that had happened finally fall on his shoulders. He had entered that mansion with the intention of stealing but had left with something much greater, a sense of justice and the certainty that he had done the right thing. A few minutes later, the old man, now under the care of paramedics, was brought over to Max. The man looked frail, but his eyes were full of gratitude. He approached, holding Max's hand with trembling hands. "You saved my life, boy," the old man said, his voice still weak but sincere. "I thought I was alone, that no one cared." Max looked at the man, remembering all the times he thought he was alone in the world too, especially after his father abandoned him. But in that moment, he realized there was more to life than just surviving. There was the chance to help, to make a difference. "I just did what needed to be done," Max replied humbly. The paramedics placed the old man on a stretcher, ready to take him to the hospital. But before leaving, he gripped Max's hand tightly one last time. "I'll never forget what you did for me. When all this is over, I'll make sure your life changes too." Max didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but he nodded, feeling a deep emotional weight. The old man was being taken to safety, and justice would be served. Everything was finally coming to an end. As the ambulance and police cars drove away, Max lay back, allowing himself to finally relax. He had done the right thing, and that, in itself, was the greatest victory he could imagine. A few weeks had passed since the incident at the mansion. Max was sitting in the living room of his small house, still recovering from the shoulder wound. His mother, now with the medication she needed, was doing much better. Although their life was still simple, there was a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He no longer needed to steal to survive. Then he received an unexpected visit. The old man, now stronger, walked through the door, supported by a cane but with a calm and grateful expression. "Max," the old man said, with a warm smile on his face. "It's me, Arthur. I've come to fulfill the promise I made to you." The boy stood up, confused, but before he could say anything, Arthur extended his hand and handed him an envelope. "You saved me, and now it's my turn to make sure you have a future. I've included your name in my will. When I'm gone, part of my inheritance will be yours. And until then, I'll take care of everything you and your mother need." Max was in shock. He opened the envelope with trembling hands and saw the documents confirming what Arthur was saying. He had never expected something like this. He had just tried to do the right thing without expecting any reward. I can't accept this," Max began, but Arthur gently interrupted him. "You can, and you will. Because now, you have a second chance. I saw a lot of myself in you, boy. I had no one to help me when I needed it, but you do. Now, use this opportunity to become everything you want to be." Arthur's words echoed in Max's heart. A second chance. Something he had never imagined he would have. As old Arthur left the house, Max looked at his mother, who smiled at him with pride. He knew his life would never be the same again. He had entered that mansion as a thief, desperate for money, but he had emerged as someone who finally had hope. The future was his, and he was ready to write his own story.